this is about content modeling for Decoupled Drupal. So this is based on a few workshops that we did at Palantir. One of the ones I was involved with, and then I'll talk a little bit of some things from another workshop as well. But I guess workshop is probably not the right word, but we had a sort of several-week engagement with an organization that focuses on point-of-care marketing. And so they have, for context, they serve patients and physicians, and they have about, they have content for about 50,000 offices, 1,000 hospitals, and 140,000 healthcare providers, so like doctors' offices and things. And so they have a number of different products that are all sort of, well, a lot of them are screen-based, some of them are print materials, and they have those current products, and they're looking to sort of expand their products as well, so that they can have, reuse a lot of the same content for the same similar audiences, the patients and providers, but then expand into other sorts of services too. So, yeah. So I am Dan Montgomery, work as a senior engineer and technical architect at Palantir.net. Palantir is a digital consultancy that provides web strategy, design, development, and focuses on higher education, healthcare, and government. So what I plan to talk about today is kind of go over a little bit about the organization and what challenges they had, talk about what our process was, so like a very high level, these are the stages of what we did over the engagement, what we kind of learned. So the discovery insights, model recommendations, and analysis are all kind of parts of that process. And then talk about some things that worked well and some of the challenges that we had doing this for this project and for the other one. And yeah, I think if you want to jump in with questions at any point, just, I'll try to leave some time at the end, but just jump in as well. All right, so this is an example of some of the products that they have. So on the left, you can see they have a website that serves primarily patients. On the top right, they have a screen that serves providers. So these are in sort of break rooms for physicians and other staff at hospitals and those locations that I mentioned. And it is a screen, it's not interactive, but they do have a couple segments there that they can show, like a primary thing, and then they have on the right, they have some other information that sort of goes as well, and then on the bottom there's a clock and weather. So they're kind of pulling together a bunch of different information. And on the bottom right is they have touch screens that are in their locations that sort of facilitate interactions between the patients and providers. So they want to have content, it's similar content, but it's for different audiences and different products. They have additional ones as well, but these are just some of the ones that I wanted to show as examples. So yeah, they're also thinking, we have this content that's primarily screen-based, and they have a lot of different resources and people creating the content and editing it, and they want to be able to expand into other ones. So they're looking into some future products and want to just kind of keep things open so that they can expand in the future. One of the challenges that they have is that currently they've developed each product kind of on its own. And so when they developed the website, they did that independently of developing content for the interactive screen, but they are for the same audience or similar audience, and they reuse a lot of that content. So a lot of the technology where they create the content and then where they serve the content is different. Some of this website I think is a WordPress website, whereas the screens are built using tools that use web content, but it's not using any kind of CMS on the front end. It's custom solution. And so when they create the same content, they have to enter it in two systems, and they have people that are very specialized within the organization that know how to create content for those specific devices. And so that was kind of, they've got a lot of different products, which is really great, but they don't have an easy way of coordinating all the content between them. So what we kind of went through with them was we said, hey, we were looking at other things that people had done and things that we had done, and wanted to come up with or not come up with the idea, but wanted to go through this exercise of building a master content model. So this master content model is a term that was used by Simply A in this Mayo Clinic case study, so that's a really good thing to watch as well. It covers some of the stuff that's in here, but also different things, so we kind of go into a little bit of more specifics on some stuff, and they cover like other things as well. And then also just like my experience, and I worked with a team, it was me and 2 other people, and we all kind of have experience doing Drupal architecture, so it's kind of our experience doing that coupled with this non-Drupal specific webinar case study that we were looking at and putting those things together. So this probably doesn't seem like that surprising, but the idea was, let's have one canonical database that can store all the content and serve it to all those devices. I think like that's what a lot of the people here are trying to do, so it's not a revolutionary concept like right here, but how do you get to that can be a big challenge, so that's what we're hoping to talk about. So yeah, we said, okay, you can have a database that has all the content, but you really should have thought through very well the specific content model that we're going to put within that database so that it can serve all those products. We don't want to just copy what they currently have and put all that stuff together, because it's kind of just, it's going to be one system to edit it in, but it's just going to have all the slight variations that they have across their products. So the 2 things that we were focusing on were taxonomy and content types, which isn't, again, super surprising, but we did kind of separate those into 2 tracks as we did the engagement. And the goal of all of this was to enable scalable growth so that they could add new products and they could expand their products for the company. So yeah, they also didn't want to they wanted to add new products, and they also wanted to be able to remove old products without having that be kind of a challenge. They also might want to expand into additional languages and different specialties, so they have different audiences. They have 2 primary audiences and then specialties within those audiences, and they wanted to be able to kind of add to that without having to re-architect things or necessarily recreate content. So they could kind of figure out what things were going, and that's maybe more of the taxonomy part. So yeah, the content model is going to capture key content types and the relationships. There's another way of saying the content models and taxonomy. And very important for them, I mentioned that they had a website, but primarily these are interactive screens where people are pulling out specific things, or they're getting help doing that by physicians who know about the content. So really, the content filtering and the taxonomy is most important for content administrators, because they need to create these packages where they'll put a bunch of content together that could be videos or slides, and then put them onto a screen like a TV in a system. And that's not, they need to be able to find related content. They don't need an end user to learn it very quickly all the time. It's very important for the content administrators to be able to use it. So kind of this is going to focus on that use case. There's definitely other projects where that's very much not the case. If you have a lot of end users that are navigating it, and that can have different challenges. But this was the particular one for this organization. So our structure roughly for what we did was we said, okay, we're going to spend time, and these weren't concrete segments, but basically we're going to focus on discovery at the beginning of the engagement, where we kind of learn about the organization and their current systems. We're going to analyze all that information and kind of talk to them about it. Then we'll build a model, and then we'll validate that model with them. I think the last stage is very important and isn't always like, we kind of wanted to validate along the way, but that's something that's often kind of easy to get to the end of the project and say, all right, here's our content model, we're going to tell you why it's awesome. But if you haven't kind of validated along the way and provided a way to iterate, you're missing out on a lot of chance to kind of fit it very specifically to that organization. So in a linear way, it sort of looks like this with friendlier words. what's the current state? There's a bunch of things we're going to do to figure out what that is. We're going to spend a little bit of time saying, all right, let's just restate what we need to change, and then figure out what the future state is, and figure out, what are those content models? Can we iterate through that? So that's more of a cycle. And then at the end of it, we'll, take that and talk to the broader audience within the organization. So this is very much, I think, sort of an agile-ish development cycle that we kind of just used for this engagement as well, which is fairly short, but we wanted to do all those steps. So first we're going to kind of go through those different phases and talk about the things that we did throughout those. So the discovery insights was the first sort of phase, was discovery. So what did we learn there? So kind of restating, we learned what the challenges were. They had two main bottlenecks. One was that they had to enter all the content individually into the systems. And then what that meant was that their content teams would become experts at one system and couldn't easily transition to the other system. And so they had to, it was kind of created a bottleneck because they needed somebody that really understood, okay, they're creating content the way it actually needs to be with the taxonomy that it needs to be. And there was very few people within the organization that would feel confident that they knew that system well enough that they could sign off on those things. So they wanted to be able to, well, that was the challenge. The other one was that, I kind of mentioned the second one, so which is the vocabulary. So taxonomy is very difficult. In addition to the systems being separate, the taxonomies were kind of a mix of what they need for all the different systems, and figuring out, well, which are the things that we need for this audience in this system was very, very difficult for people. So they had some people try to do it at the beginning, but it needed a lot of oversight. All right, so one of the exercises we did, and we'll come back to the exercises later, was interviews to figure out the core use cases. So I know this is kind of small and there's a lot of text, but the key point here is we did a bunch of interviews to figure out, what are some key phrases or what are some things that they said during the engagement that we said, okay, these are, I lost connection to something, but we'll hope that it's working. I have a PDF if it's not. This one in particular, they said things like, our goal for the new platform is to enter content once so it can be delivered to any product. And another thing that was important was that content was specifically worded for each audience. So they had patients and providers, but that those were similar content, but it was worded very specifically, which meant that they were also thinking about this product or this screen is for a specific audience and it's only for that audience. And so they were kind of in a lot of cases thinking like, okay, we're making this content for this product or for this audience, and it kind of blurred between what those things were. So the use case was they wanted to be able to reuse content across the products. In this specific case I mentioned a little bit, but they spend a lot of time building playlists for those systems, so they bundle them up, and then those run for a number of months, weeks or months. And so there's a lot of information that they might need about the content in order to understand like how can they fit it into those playlists. They have four main editorial strategies. So the content can exist across these, which was important for us to understand, what kinds of content are they creating. Some of the content was just general education-based or topic-based. So some of it was general, and so it could apply to a lot of things. Some of it was specifically topic-based, and they needed a way of categorizing that. They also had general stuff that was about compliance that they needed to include within these playlists, and then certain things that were just there to kind of engage the audience so that they would view the rest of the content. And kind of putting all of that together was a mix of using their existing systems and using sort of more or less like hand manage, we're pulling this thing out and putting it in another one. There was a lot of manual work. The second to last one is that the ad sales was very important for them, and so the way that they're understanding their ad system was important. This was something that kind of came up at once, and then we kind of gradually learned more and more about it. And so the way that they build their ads is that they'll have an advertiser with a specific purpose, and they need to find content that can fit around that. And so the advertiser wants the content to be fairly narrow in certain cases if the product that they're advertising or the service is very specific, and in other cases it needs to be more broad. So that hierarchy of different specificities is kind of a challenge, because in some cases they need to be, this overarching thing, and in other cases they need to drill down into a very, very specific topic. So that gets to kind of smart tagging. So within all that tagging system, they don't want to have to tag things that are related. So if they tag something with a very specific term, they would like the general term to also be tagged, so that they don't need to remember that this type of physician is interested in these different topics. That was a big challenge for them. All right, so those were just kind of stating the challenges. We'll come back to how we did the analysis, but I wanted to jump forward into what we kind of landed with. So again, it's kind of a rewording of it, but we wanted one content repository that's going to serve all the products, and it's going to do that with an API. So it's not going to be one site across all those sites, but it's going to have an API. And we did a proof of concept using Drupal, but we didn't want to say that this had to be Drupal, or that it had to be JSON API or GraphQL or some other system. So they had some existing prototypes that they were working through, but this was focused mostly on that part. So yeah, this seems kind of obvious in retrospect since we're at this conference, but that's what we kind of presented. And they were thinking about that, I think, before we joined. So the content repository is going to store all the editable content. So they have a lot of content like weather that I mentioned that's not editable. And so we wanted this to be focused on just the content that they could edit within the organization. We also wanted to store content that wasn't necessarily created in the organization, but sat alongside in a very similar way editable. So that they have certain agreements with organizations where they'll take articles and they'll republish them on their website. And they wanted to have easy access to either those or the ones that they'd created themselves, or maybe ones that they have the permission to edit, to reword things for their own audiences. They also wanted to categorize all this stuff in one place. They had kind of several layers where they were categorizing. Some of it was very manual, and they wanted to be able to do that in the content repository. And then we wanted to say that we wanted one content API that was going to be shared by all those products. And those products are using some similar systems, but they would have, somebody had mentioned this in another one, but essentially like adapters to say all right, this product needs to transform the data from the API and present it in its specific format. And they would need to do that, but it would all come from the shared API. And then one of the key things was we wanted the format of the API to be pretty much exactly what the content API was, or sorry, what the master content model was. That was our suggestion. So yeah, so the recommendations in more specificity that we gave, we'll talk about taxonomy and then the content types. So for taxonomy, taxonomy is incredibly difficult. We'll get that back to a little bit more of that later in the challenges. But we gave them some guiding principles, and we said, all right, we're going to do some exercises and we're going to give some suggestions. We're not going to be able to rework the whole taxonomy because we don't have the area expertise, but we had several discussions where we said, here's some principles that you can work through as you're auditing your current taxonomy. So we wanted to say that you should tag you should tag the content based on the information, not based on the products and things. And we'll get into some of the things that we kind of moved around with. We also said that the terms should be applicable to a general audience. So they had a lot of terms that might have been very specific to one of their audiences, but not the other. And if possible, we wanted them to try to think about if they could generalize those. We also wanted to say, you could have multiple taxonomy vocabularies that can combine into something. So if you had, I'm trying to see what the example was. if you had a topic like cardiovascular health or heart health, and you had something like treatments, those could be separate taxonomies, and you could tag it with both. You don't need to have all the combinations that say, cardiovascular treatments, and then make another one that's, cardiovascular general information or stuff like that. So being able to split out a handful or a smaller number of terms across categories and then join those together was going to be helpful to reduce the complexity. And then we also wanted to say that within the API, we're going to be able to provide certain information like language information, the type of content or the purpose of the content within the API as properties of the content, and so those don't need to also exist as taxonomy terms or vocabularies. So yeah, so some of the key takeaways, which I've mentioned already, kind of were we're going to tag across all the products. We're going to just separate audiences from products, and that was one of the key things that we wanted to talk through. It sounds simple, but if the organization was mostly thinking about products as specific audiences or audiences products, it was kind of a challenging thing to figure out how does that fit very well within the organization. And then we wanted to focus on these second order relationships. So the example was, we had a specialty that was interested in several topics. We didn't want to tag things with the specialty. We wanted to tag things with those topics, and then we could maintain those relationships externally. So in Drupal, this could look like one vocabulary term that has references to other vocabulary terms, but it could be set up in another way, and then you can maintain those relationships. So if you add a new topic, you might decide later that this specialty is interested in that or is not interested in it. One of the things that was happening was they had general purpose stuff that they wanted available for everybody, and so they would go and tag a lot of stuff with this is general purpose, which is kind of a challenge because almost everything could have been tagged with general purpose, and so it was just kind of a difficult thing to do. So some of the ones they kept were content providers. So this was a very important thing for them to be able to go back and audit their content and either remove things or change it if it needed to be changed. We added vocabularies for audience, demographic information, topics, and specialties. And then we removed tagging that was based on products, groupings, languages, templates, and categories. And those are, some of these are, templates was more about how it was presented and product specific, and categories was kind of a catch-all for like a lot of things. They had a few different vocabularies that were sort of they built over time that maybe had intended to be separate ways of thinking about things, but things kind of ended up in all kinds of places. So for the content types, we started by saying, okay, how are we going to define the content types? So there's a lot of different ways you can do that. You could say, okay, the content types are going to include, different audiences will have different content types. You could have, a article for a provider, and you could have a separate content type that's articles for patients. You could have subjects. You could have the different products, so we're going to have an article for this product, an article for this product. That would be kind of combining all the things. Format, so if this is an image, it's going to be a content type. If it's video, maybe it's like a media catch-all, and that's a content type. Or it could be specific to the field. So we could do an audit and say, here's all the different fields that each of them has. These all have the same fields. They're the same content type. It can also be a mix of all those things, so there's really no right answer, but this is where, there's lots and lots of variability, and I think the default that happens a lot of times is to say, okay, our organization knows that we display videos and images for this product, so we're going to have images and videos, and those are two content types, and then we're going to go to another one, and they display quizzes, and so that's another content type, and just kind of build there, and you end up with a lot of things that could potentially be very similar, and it doesn't promote reuse. So our recommendation was to focus primarily on the objective of the content. What is the person that's viewing or consuming the content trying to do with it, or what is the organization trying to get people to do, and what is the structure of the content? So, does it have a title and a description? Does it have I guess those are maybe more specific, so we'll get into those a little bit more. But this isn't something that we came up with. It was something that was used in the other case study that I mentioned, and based on this system called Darwin Information Typing Architecture, which I had never heard of. But there's good information on Wikipedia about that, and it kind of says more or less in a longer sentence, primary, objective, and structure. And it was developed for, I believe, more technical information, but I think it does a good job of sort of summarizing some of the ways that you can think about it as well. So our content types that we ended up with, among other ones, were these ones. And so I'll go over a couple of them, just at a high level to give you an idea of like what we were trying to communicate as a content type. So a highlight, the names are the best that we could come up with, but it's very challenging to name things, as everybody knows. So we came up with the idea of a highlight, which was going to quickly engage the audience while also being informative. So it's sort of a quote or a stat or something that's like very, very brief, and then somebody looks at it and says like, oh yeah, that's interesting, and they stick around to see the rest of the content that's on that device. Single topic content, so it's longer than something that's very individual, like a highlight, but it's maybe like one topic about this specific disease or this specific treatment. Quizzes where you can ask questions and people stick around and then they kind of think about it themselves. It engages the audience because they're participating in it. Illustration was to facilitate a discussion between an audience. So in the interactive display that I showed, a lot of things would be brought up by physicians, and then they would say, you know, here's an anatomy diagram of this part of the body, and it would help facilitate that discussion. So it wasn't really like a standalone piece of content. It was sort of helping with that. They had news, which was the timeliness of news is important. Promotions were trying to get people to take a specific action. Guides were multiple topics where you really wanted to read, you know, front to end about, like, I don't know anything about this topic. I want you to walk me through all the stuff. Multiple topics were a little bit different, where they had content that was like, hey, here's like a bunch of things about this. You don't need to read it in order. Like maybe skim and see which headlines you want to read, and you can kind of jump around. So maybe like a Wikipedia page. And then they had weather information, which again was timely and very specific, and we didn't think it fit within the other ones. So some of the benefits of this approach are that the same piece of content can be used by different products. Like there was nothing product specific in there. We can also, some of them can require text or images. So you might be able to serve the same content like a news item in just text if the product only supports text, or you can add images. A lot of their devices have video support and audio support. Some of them don't have audio support. So you can add all this media around it to enhance that content, but you can also strip away media from content to create it for other platforms. So the content can also be translated to different audiences more easily. It can be grouped by purpose. So when they're selecting content, they might say like, I want a promotion, and then I want to highlight, and then I'll put like a single content. And you can kind of think about the experience that you want the customer to have based on that content structure. Filtering, and then that's kind of the filtering purpose of it. Some of the challenges are that you end up with an editorial experience where you may end up with an editorial experience where people have to kind of understand like, oh, there's all these fields. Do I need to put information in all of them, or can I just use, you know, the ones that I have for the specific product? And then the individual devices have to be a bit more intelligent to know, okay, I can only, it's kind of like GraphQL, like I only can use these fields, so I'm only going to request that information, and I'm going to throw out, or not throw out, but I'm just not going to use images or audio because I don't support that. So for this work engagement, we focused on 4 primary content types that they had selected as high priority ones that they wanted us to look at. So those were the highlight, single topic, quiz, and illustration. And one of the tools that we used to kind of build through this and to facilitate the discussions were wireframes. So, you know, that shouldn't be a new concept, but these are they were not blurred during the thing, but I wanted to kind of generalize them. So this is like a very simple example of a highlight on a touchscreen device, so that interactive device that you saw. So a highlight could be a big image. This one was an infographic with a couple key points, and then they also had citations. So having citations to build trust was very important for all their systems. So we wanted to add that to all the content types. So this is the touch device, and then on the website, you have the same sort of system, except you can add a title to it. You could have body text where maybe somebody just wants to kind of read a little bit more about it, and they can read it without looking through the image. And it still has the citation, which is a link if it's available and people want that information. So this was the website, and then they had multiple different versions of, they had TV screens that were used for different purposes. So one of them, we said like, okay, this one probably doesn't fit perfectly, but you could use your highlight content on these television screens. You saw the one had sort of 3 different spots. So some of those were more interactive, or not interactive, but had more motion, and some of those were used as static images. So either highlight could be images or video, but it could be placed in those slots. And then, some of their devices that had audio could kind of create a video around that infographic where they had existing content, where they were showing content, and they would kind of animate it on screen, and it would be similar to like a static infographic on a website, but they would add animation and background music to kind of catch people's attention. So that was another thing they could do. This one is very simple, so I think it does a decent enough job of sort of illustrating with how we work with the organization to say like, hey, these are existing things that you have in a bunch of different places, and you can reuse them across your products. We included other things like voice communication and stuff, which isn't super easy to show. So what this looks like we kind of built a proof of concept in Drupal to show them, what it might look like as an editorial experience. So I think that's kind of small, but we showed them that like, okay, here's all the fields you might have. This highlight is going to primarily be probably an image, a video. It's going to have a transcript field if you want to use that for text. And then they also have, as I mentioned, a lot of need for information about the source data. So if they wanted to recreate the content for another audience or for another product, sometimes they would go back to the content. And so being able to provide sort of this data that's not really consumed by their products, but it's consumed by the editorial team, was going to be valuable. So we had a whole sort of set of fields for that. And then usage restrictions. So there's certain content could be used in only certain ways, and so we added some information around that they could provide. And then lastly, sort of the taxonomy that was used for filtering was another set of fields. So the content definition, I'm not sure what. Right, so this is going to be, and in addition to the wireframes, we built content type definitions for all of those types of content as starting points for the organization. So I'll kind of walk through the highlight one pretty quickly, and then we did that for the other ones as well. So we've got probably about like 10. Okay, I'll go through some of these. So, all right, so for the highlight, we focused first on the purpose. So I've stated that already for highlight, but we kind of wanted to frame within the organization, like this is the purpose of this content for the audience. We gave a description that said, practically speaking, this is probably a static image or a very static video to tie it to the current content types. The products, as I mentioned, can determine how visually engaging those are, but not really what the information or the tone is. So that was going to be consistent no matter where they put that content. It's also relatively easy to update existing content, to add images, or to provide text versions of video that they could then use on other products. This replaced these 5 content types, among other ones probably. So they had infographics currently that were displayed on some of the TV devices. They had infographics on the website, which were separate but very similar. They had polls, which were basically static summaries of polls. They had something called screen feeds and something called trends. And so these were across a bunch of different devices, but they sort of served that similar purpose. And that was the case for the other ones as well. So our deliverables for taxonomy were a set of recommended terms, the suggestions that I mentioned before. We also had a document and a discussion with them about the taxonomy approach and how they could kind of organize their taxonomy. And then we built that Drupal demo prototype that they could use to sort of play around with and see how it might work to tag content. For the content model deliverables, it was mostly what I just showed, but just in document form. So we had the high-level content model, which went over all the different content types. We had a set of global field definitions, so there was a lot of fields that were just shared across everything, and all of those had the same sort of like, this is the field, this is examples of what could be in that field, and this is sort of descriptions. We had an aggregated field summary, which I'll show, which is a spreadsheet. A lot of people like looking at spreadsheets to compare the data, so we wanted to provide it that way. And then we had documents for each of the content types that went over, here's examples of what those could be. And then the Drupal demo code base also had that information. All right, I think we have 10 minutes. I'm going to jump through some of this stuff and then try to open up questions. So the analysis part, we went through, sort of used a bunch of tools across this project and similar projects. And so these are things that we used, that we didn't come up with them, but we found them helpful in the engagement. So first thing we sort of sent over was a content audit worksheet, which was a Google document spreadsheet that said, we just need to know as much as we can about your products. And so we provided, here's all the things we could know. Can you give us all this information? And they were really helpful to do that. And we used this as a working document throughout the project to go back and reference, like, okay, what was that again? What is the example content that I can use? That sort of thing. So they provided content samples, which were very important. We had a sheet on content workflow to understand how their editorial process worked. This is mostly an editorial-focused engagement. And then we asked them we kind of made summaries based on that information about, what are their audiences, creators, products, content types, and categorization that they currently have, so that we can kind of verify with them and then build on that. So we also asked for a discovery, or what am I trying to say? We did a delivery audit worksheet that we sent over, and they took images and video. They took photographs and video and screenshots of all their existing products, and that was really helpful for us because we didn't have them in front of us to really understand, like, oh, this is how people interact with them and use them. On not this project, but on a more website-focused project, we started with a site crawl to really identify, in this case, the large section that you can see is duplicated content. So they had content that was just reused across multiple pages. So that was important for us to understand, like, why that was the case. And then sort of figure out, the most used content in this case was these 4 things, including profiles and news items. And then those were maybe the things we should focus on, and then the other kind of took up a smaller subset of those. I mentioned the one-on-one interviews. We found those very, very helpful at the beginning to identify the use cases and to kind of facilitate the discussions and use examples that resonated with them throughout the engagement. We did a taxonomy card sort, which, if you're not familiar, is writing down all the terms onto a physical piece of paper or digital versions of those, and then asking different people to put them into groups. So we did this with different parts of their editorial team, and then facilitated discussions around that to kind of talk through, all right, like, what are the different ways that you see that this content, and how would you group them if they were abstracted away from the current ways that they were already doing it? Strategy discussions, a lot of the things, particularly the content type driver, the taxonomy changes, and the audience, splitting that out from products, were really big conversations that were changes from how they were doing things. And so we wrote these documents to kind of walk through our recommendations, sent it to a smaller group, and then had discussions with them and iterated on the recommendations to make sure that they fit within that organization. I think the iteration was super important because we might not have gotten it exactly correct, and we wanted the recommendations to be reasonable things that they could do and not just totally off from what their organization needs were. This was the comparison document, so it has all of the fields, what their purposes were, what types they are, and then all the different content types, and they could easily say, oh yeah, like these shared fields like title are for all of them, but images don't show up in quizzes. There are different types of things. So that was helpful. And then we validated it primarily with the Drupal site and with those discussions. So this was the iterative process that I was mentioning. So yeah, to recap, we kind of went through discovery, analysis, I'm forgetting the words that we used, but creating the model and then validating the model. The things that worked well were we had people within the organization that were developers and very familiar with Drupal, and that helped us kind of talk with them and then bring the topics to the larger group. We used those working documents, which eventually became the deliverables. So we were iterating through what we were going to deliver very early, and we were kind of seeing if that resonated with the organization. We built the early version of the content model, again, to iterate. We set aside time specifically for those discussions early so that the organization could kind of think through them and come back and say like, yeah, you're off base on this, we need you to iterate on it, or no, that one's good. Or let's just think about it for a week and see, you know, how would this impact things? And they could kind of raise red flags over time, which sometimes it just takes some time to do that. The visual wireframes and anything visual was incredibly helpful for the larger audience that we were talking to. They could really say like, oh yeah, I can envision these things that you're telling me within the products that I'm familiar with. Some of the challenges were that, you know, we had limited time to understand the very, very large and complex technology system that they were using. They were using proprietary technology, other systems. We spent enough time that we felt like we knew the important bits and the limitations that they provided, but there's just a lot there. Also, taxonomy is just incredibly difficult. We tried to find, this was something that I think the Economist case study covered, and they were able to find better existing taxonomies that people had set up. We tried to use like 4 or 5 existing taxonomies, like I forget what the organizations were, but like very well known organizations that had created systems for organizing medical content, and I was like, this just isn't a fit. Like we worked with the organization and they're like, yeah, this isn't going to work. It's either too much or it's not aggregated in the right way. So that's just a very difficult problem, and I think, you know, setting up those guidelines and working through them is maybe the only thing. Yeah.
So did they have like many vocabularies? Is that?
Yeah, I think they had like 12 different vocabularies. Some of them were just sort of general, what are the categories? So it's actually comments and questions. So thank you, and then we'll get to yeah.
Sure.
So yeah, the comments and questions. So the so it was those things like they had products as a vocabulary. So that was, you know, one that's, we said you shouldn't have, we were recommending not doing that and focusing on audience and other stuff that could stand in for products. But yeah, they had ones that were trying to capture, like, these are the types of physicians that might exist and their specialty based on like titles that they might have. But then these are diseases and these are conditions and treatments. A lot of the sponsorships that they would get would be for specific treatment options or like drugs and devices. So they needed to be able to categorize content in that way. And so it was just like a lot of different ways of thinking about medical information. And they had a bunch of different vocabularies to do that. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I have a follow-up. So, and basically, did they not get it? The vocabularies they had, that's a situation that we had.
Okay.
I actually built the term manager with a third-party vendor.
Okay.
No one uses it.
Yeah, so that's probably like a similar thing. They had the vocabulary set up, and then there were certain limitations with their third parties. They had contracted a company to build the system to build all their programs, and that had some UI limitations, which meant that they couldn't easily filter by multiple vocabularies at the same time, and so they had kind of shoved a lot of stuff into one, which was a challenge. And so there was a lot of complexity where, you know, it was just that hierarchy that I mentioned where like this specific use case needs something to be very, very specific, and this one needs to be very, very broad. And like, how do you tackle all those things at once? And so we were trying to say like, yeah, none of the existing ones, like you can't just filter out the list from this 10,000 term thing, which is maybe is what they did in that case, right? Of like, oh yeah, we're going to look at this massive list which has every term you could ever think of, and we're going to pick out the ones we need. And it's like that, they tried that already and it didn't really work. And we looked for other ones that were maybe different levels of granularity, and they were also kind of like a mix of things, and it seemed like everybody just kind of had this problem. So
sounds familiar.
Yeah, there was no like easy solution. Our solution was, let's try to make it so that you can separate the vocabularies and combine things, and then also really clearly try to define the level that this vocabulary is going to be. Like, this vocabulary is only a high level vocabulary. It's not going to go,
Right.
It's not going to be a mix of stuff.
It sounds like they were stair stepping down a lot. I mean, they were going
When needed. They basically, what would happen is like a new promotion would come along, and they'd say, okay, well, we need like a very specific term, so they would add it, and then there would be a very specific term for that case, but they might not need it like next year because that wasn't existing anymore. But if you're a content editor, you go in there and you're like, well, which one am I supposed to select? All of them, or just like this one? And it's just kind of confusing. So yeah, we're 1 minute over, so if you want to head out, you can. If there's any other questions, I can stick around. Or
can you go back to the last slide?
The one with my picture on it? Okay. I have like a card or something if you want my email. Yeah.
Can you post your slides, please?
Yeah, I do want to post them. I'm not sure how we're doing it at the conference, but I will figure out how that works. And
put them on SlideShare and they'll come up, some like just searching for the title.
Okay, yeah, we'll definitely, I think, put them on the website, so palantir.net website, and then, which is that, the name of the company is also the website. There's another Palantir, which is not palantir.net. So yeah, we'll post them there. They probably won't be like immediately, but let me know if you want them quicker, and I can figure that out. But yeah, there's a lot of different stuff. Good idea. Any other?
I have a question on did the client talk to you about how to maintain this content model moving forward? Like you do content modeling,
Sure.
you make these decisions,
Mm-hmm.
and then politics come in. Like they have a recommendation, and then what's the reality?
Yeah,
They
so
set up a system in place if someone says, I want a new field, I want this data, I want a new content type.
yeah, so that's a good question. We didn't cover that part. So this was like, we wanted to really dive deep into the specifics on this one, so we didn't cover that. That's something that, if you're interested in how some people have done it, the Mayo Clinic case study, I don't know if you were here at the beginning.
I'm familiar with healthcare, so Mayo,
Yeah, so they did a case study with another organization, Simply A, and they talked about like, here's all the governance stuff that they recommended around that, and how it fits into those pieces. So I have thoughts as well, but we didn't do that for these specific engagements. So yeah.
Did you find a lot of overlap between your content types? Because your list of them, most of them sounded pretty much the same, other than kind of the metadata that would go with them. The content is mostly, you got a text field,
Mm-hmm.
you got a media field, and it's the descriptive stuff that's outside that almost is peripheral to
Mm-hmm.
the content that is really what's defining your content types.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we wanted to focus, so in this case, like we wanted to focus on the objective over the structure. So you could easily do the other thing. And we talked about that with the organization. Like, you could say, to your point, like, if these you could have one content type that just has all the different types of fields you could have, and then you put whatever you want in them, right? And so you only have one content type. That's easy in some senses and difficult in the other. We felt like it was important to recommend thinking about it from like the consumer perspective of like, what are they trying to do with the content? Even if it's the same exact fields on two different content types, like we wanted them to think about it as, yeah, when I sort this, I'm going to fill a slot, because they had programs that had slots for things like this. So they were doing it in different ways and just kind of making the leap, using the internal knowledge to say, okay, I need an infographic to fill this purpose, and I need a video to fill this purpose, but the video has to be this length because that's the kind of video that fits within this slot. So a lot of these things could be videos on the video devices, but you can have a highlight that's like 5 seconds, and then you can have a single topic that's 5 minutes, and you can have multiple topic thing or a guide, like a travel guide or whatever other information that's like a half an hour. And so they're all videos with the same stuff, but they serve very different purposes. So we wanted them to think about it in that way, and that was like a big challenge. They were definitely not on board with it at the beginning, but that's where we focused on those discussions, and we had we showed it to them, we showed them the different variations, we iterated on that. This wasn't the initial, we didn't just throw it out and it stayed that way, like it changed. And yeah, we focused on the ones that they wanted, which were these top 4. And so we didn't kind of get to some of those other ones, and those might change, kind of as you mentioned. Like they might decide that the difference between multiple topics and single topics is not relevant. One of the reasons we recommended it was also, sorry. Well, if somebody is here to do their presentation, just kick me off whenever that is that.
There's a break right after their session,
Okay.
so you got time.
Okay, cool. So yeah, they had devices where they were really pulling up like, I just need to know about the treatment options for this disease. Like I'm in this place, or I need to build together a booklet that's about this, and I need just this single topic. And I don't want to have to like pull up a list of content that's like, oh yeah, this one is named something, and so I know it's just about that, but this one has like 10 topics in it, and it's more of this purpose, right? And so, yeah, they just had a lot of different ways that they were putting it together. I don't know if that answers your question, or if you have
Kind of
thoughts.
does. I mean, I worked on a system similar to this, and
yeah.
I mean, even from we defined some content types right at the start that we ended up never using.
Okay, yeah.
Because there was so much overlap.
Yeah, you're like, okay, this is, yeah, so I mean, I imagine that could be what, I think the value of the engagement was a lot of the principles. So we were really working with like a core team that had been doing some of this before, and then building it out and selling it to the larger sets of content teams. So like each of the products that I mentioned, there was a bunch of them. Even within like television screens, there was different audiences for those. That internal group was selling that concept to the larger group and really getting the whole organization on board with it. So yeah, I imagine that the things are going to change. They might make some content types that they're going to say, this isn't actually super useful anymore. Let's get rid of it or combine it or something like that. So the goal, I think, was to set it up to facilitate that conversation, which for me, like the point of like story writing and development is the same thing. Like your goal for me is not just have like a list of here's exactly what you do, but to kind of expose those conversations and like, this is what we're trying to do. And you're also, as implementing it and as maintaining it, like you have a lot of expertise, so you can take what we started with and like, it doesn't have to stay exactly that way. Like that's just to convey kind of where we were at. Cool. Any other stuff, or yeah, good to go?
You got a lot of questions for a small audience.
The audience like doubled in size as you came in from the rain.
No, I know, but just note.
Cool. All right, I'm gonna press the button.